The prison didn't circle any star. Instead, it floated out in the black emptiness between solar systems, well away from trade routes and any kind of communication traffic. No sunlight ever bounced off its hull. There wasn't even a nearby planet to break up its silhouette. The whole place had been constructed with one purpose in mind: to be forgotten. In Containment Sector 9, even the guards tried not to hang around any longer than necessary. That sector held beings classified as apex violent, species collected from failed colonies, ruined war zones, and planets where extinction had already taken hold. These were creatures considered too dangerous to simply execute, too valuable for research to destroy, and far too unstable to place anywhere else. Some of them were enormous. Some were lightning fast. Others were intelligent in ways that made the staff deeply uncomfortable. But every single one of them had one thing in common: they were kept alone. Each cell was a reinforced chamber, built from layered alloys and woven energy mesh. The lighting stayed low to keep the occupants from becoming overstimulated. Automated systems pushed nutrient packs through sealed delivery ports. The guards monitored everything through thick polarized glass and remote drones. Physical contact wasn't allowed under any circumstances. Warden Tarex liked things exactly that way. Tarex belonged to the Serati species, tall, rigid, and built around a segmented exoskeleton. His head rose into a narrow crest, lined with sensory filaments that twitched along the edges. When he spoke, his voice had a dry, echoing quality that always sounded precise. He believed fear was the most reliable method of containment. And right now, he had a problem. The human hadn't played along. Adrian Vale stood in the middle of the intake hall with his hands secured behind his back. He was 32 years old, broad-shouldered, with short dark hair and a thin scar slicing across his left eyebrow. Former infantry. He'd been captured during a border conflict after the rest of his unit was wiped out. When they took him, he hadn't begged. He hadn't tried to bargain either. Instead, he had looked Tarex straight in the eyes and calmly said, "You can lock me up. That's fine." It wasn't the words that bothered Tarex. It was the tone. Tarex disliked defiance that carried no fear behind it. "You have been disruptive," Tarex told him now. "You encouraged resistance among labor units. You also assaulted one of my guards." "He put his hands on me first," Vale answered. "You are not in a position to justify your actions." Vale gave a small shrug. "Then go ahead and do whatever you brought me here for." Tarex's crest tightened slightly. "I intend to." Containment Sector 9 required 3 different levels of authorization before anyone could even enter. As Tarex escorted Vale down the heavily reinforced corridor, 2 armored guards followed several paces behind. Even with the human restrained, they wore full shock armor. The air felt heavier the deeper they went. Energy fields hummed through the walls, vibrating faintly underfoot. Somewhere behind the metal came distant sounds, scratching, a slow rhythmic thud, and something that might have been breathing. Vale noticed. He just didn't say anything about it. They eventually stopped in front of a thick blast door covered with hazard glyphs written in 5 different languages. "Sector 9, Tarex said. "You will be placed in close proximity with apex violent entities. Your chances of surviving are extremely low." Vale rolled his shoulders once, quietly testing the restraints. "Okay." Tarex studied him carefully. "You do not understand," the warden said. "These creatures have torn apart reinforced drones. Some have even broken their own limbs attempting escape. They do not respond to threats or negotiation." "Sounds like it's going to be a long week," Vale replied. The door opened. The first thing that came out was heat. The second thing was the smell, thick, metallic, and heavy. The central corridor of Sector 9 formed a circular ring with containment cells positioned like slices around a central observation hub. Energy barriers shimmered across the entrances to every cell. Normally, each creature remained isolated. Today, Tarex decided to change that. He signaled toward the control station, "Disable the internal partitions between cells 3 through 6. One of the technicians hesitated. "Warden, protocol strongly advises against exposing multiple entities at once." "I am aware." The interior energy walls flickered for a moment before shutting down. The 4 individual chambers fused together into a single, larger containment space. Inside that space, something began to move. The first creature was a Varchesh, 8 feet tall, standing upright, with thick plaited hide covering its body. 4 forward-facing arms ended in jagged bone hooks. Its eyes were small and sunken, built for hunting in low-light ambush conditions. During its capture, it had already killed 6 guards. The second creature was a Drail predator, long, lean, and built on digitigrade legs. Its jaw split vertically when it opened. Records showed its reflexes were faster than standard security turrets. The third was an Urkoon brute, huge, thick, with layered muscle and skin that looked like stretched stone. Its strategy was simple: smash barriers through relentless force. The fourth entity was harder to describe. The record simply called it a lattice entity, because its skeletal frame seemed to shift constantly beneath semi-transparent flesh. It moved with a deeply unsettling fluidity, as if its bones slid freely under its skin. The newly merged chamber gave all 4 creatures room to move. Tarex turned back toward Vale. "You will enter that chamber." Vale looked through the polarized barrier at the shapes inside. The Varchesh was already pacing. The Drail had tilted its head slightly, sniffing the air. The Urkoon stood near the far wall, perfectly still, but clearly aware. Meanwhile, the lattice creature drifted slowly along the perimeter, its limbs bending at angles that didn't look physically possible. Vale only asked one question. "How long?" Tarex thought about it for a moment. "Until compliance." Vale gave a single nod. "Fine." The guard stepped forward and removed the restraints from his wrists. The energy barrier dropped. For a brief moment, nothing happened. Then the Varchesh charged. Its heavy feet slammed against the floor as it rushed forward, bone hooks stretching outward. Its goal was simple: crush the human before he could react. Vale didn't run. At the last possible moment, he stepped sideways. The Varchesh slammed headfirst into the wall where he had been standing. The impact rattled the entire chamber. Vale closed the distance immediately. He moved in too tight for the creature's hooks to swing properly. Then he drove his elbow straight into the joint where the upper and lower arm plates overlapped. The strike was deliberate, precise. The Varchesh roared and twisted violently. Vale didn't try to overpower it. Instead, he stepped back right away, creating space before the creature could counterattack. From the side, the Drail lunged. Vale dropped low. The Drail's claws raked across his back, shredding fabric and slicing skin. Blood appeared. He ignored it. Rolling beneath the creature's center of mass, Vale came up beside one of its hind legs. He kicked the joint sideways. The Drail staggered, more surprised than injured. Inside the observation hub, technicians stared at the monitors. "He's not panicking," one of them whispered. "He's provoking them," another said quietly. Back inside the chamber, the Urkoon began moving forward, slow, heavy, and unstoppable. Vale took stock of the situation. 4 opponents, each with different speed, different strengths. He kept shifting position constantly, refusing to let himself get boxed in. Instead of fighting them head-on, he started using the creatures against each other. When the Varchesh swung wide, Vale slipped aside, and the hook tore into the Drail's shoulder instead. And when the Urkoon charged, Vale angled away so the massive brute smashed straight into the lattice entity, sending both of them crashing to the floor. Minutes went by, and Vale took his share of punishment. A grazing strike from one of the hooks split open the skin along his forearm. The Drail managed to rake across his ribs, leaving burning lines behind, and a heavy backhand from the Urkin slammed him into the wall hard enough to blur his vision. Still, every single time he hit the ground, he got back up. He never yelled. He never made threats. Instead, he watched them closely, studying how they breathed, how they moved. He paid attention to their tells. The Varchesh started favoring its upper left arm after that elbow strike, and the Drail always hesitated just a fraction of a second before fully committing to a leap. So, he adjusted. After about 20 minutes, the attacks stopped coming in coordinated bursts. The creatures began to hesitate, and the human was still standing. Tarex leaned forward inside the observation chamber. "Why do they not finish him?" he demanded. "Unclear," a technician answered. "They appear uncertain." Inside the containment zone, Vale leaned briefly against the wall, pulling in steady breaths. Blood ran down his side, and his right eye had begun to swell nearly shut. The Varchesh approached again, but this time its movements were slower. Vale locked eyes with it. Instead of backing away, he stepped forward. The creature stopped. Vale struck twice in quick succession, targeting the same weakened joint. The Varchesh flinched and backed up 3 full steps. It retreated. The Drail began circling, but its behavior had changed too. It no longer lunged blindly. Now it kept its distance, calculating. The Urkin stopped charging altogether, remaining near the far side of the chamber, watching carefully. Above them, the lattice entity clung to the wall, limbs wrapped around structural supports. Vale didn't chase any of them. He lowered himself to the floor and sat against the wall, breathing hard but under control. The creatures stayed spread apart. For the next hour, none of them attacked again. Inside the observation hub, silence settled over the room. Tarex felt irritation crawling beneath his exoskeleton. "Increase light levels," he ordered. The chamber brightened slightly, and the creatures shifted with visible discomfort. Vale squinted, but stayed seated. Hours passed. The creatures began testing him in smaller ways. A sudden rush from the Drail that stopped short, a feint from the Varchesh, meant to provoke a reaction. Each time, Vale answered with fast, controlled force, enough to hurt, never enough to overcommit. By the end of the first cycle, none of the 4 creatures had landed a clean, decisive strike. None of them had broken him. Instead, the atmosphere inside the chamber changed. The chaos faded, replaced by something more measured and deliberate. The Urkin rested against the far wall, conserving strength. The Drail paced at a careful distance. The Varchesh sat with its injured arm held tight against its body. The lattice entity watched from above. Vale rested with his back against solid metal, eyes half closed but fully alert. At one point, he spoke quietly. "Pick your shots." The creatures didn't understand the words, but they understood the tone. In the observation room, a junior guard swallowed nervously. "Warden, behavior metrics are changing," he said carefully. "Aggression spikes are dropping." Tarex stared at the display screens. The human had been placed there to be broken. Instead, Sector 9 had grown quiet. For the first time since records began, 4 apex violent entities were not trying to kill each other or destroy their surroundings. They were watching a human, and they were thinking. Tarex straightened slightly. "Maintain surveillance," he ordered. "Do not interfere." He expected time itself to correct the anomaly. Inside the chamber, Vale finally allowed himself to close his eyes for a brief rest. The Varchesh shifted cautiously, testing the moment. Vale's eyes opened. Instantly, the creature froze, Silence returned. Hours stretched into a full cycle. The monsters still didn't finish him. They waited. By the second cycle, the chamber no longer felt like a feeding pit. It felt like contested ground. Adrian Vale stood near the center of the containment zone, weight evenly balanced and breathing calm and steady. His injuries had stiffened overnight. Dark bruises spread across his ribs, and the cut along his forearm had dried into a tight, pale line. Across the chamber, the Varchesh shifted its weight, but didn't advance, its injured arm still tucked protectively against its armored torso. The Drail stayed low, pacing in a wide half-circle while carefully avoiding a direct approach. The Irkun conserved its strength near the reinforced wall, its massive chest rising and falling in slow, controlled breaths. Above them, the lattice entity remained along the upper framework, its bones sliding subtly beneath translucent flesh. The surveillance team had expected chaos. Instead, the data showed distance. From the observation hub, Warden Tarex watched with his crest held rigid. "He is altering their engagement cycles," one technician said. "Aggression spikes peak early and collapse." "Explain," Tarex replied. "They initiate, he counters, then they disengage." Inside the chamber, the Drail tested him again, lunging halfway before abruptly aborting the attack when Vale stepped toward the angle instead of retreating. Vale didn't pursue. During the first cycle, he had learned something important. These creatures relied as much on intimidation as they did on raw strength. Their dominance depended on overwhelming reactions. Prey ran, prey screamed, prey made mistakes. He did none of those things. He stayed still until movement actually required a response. The Irkun shifted forward, taking 2 heavy steps. Vale met it directly. When the brute swung in a wide arc, Vale slipped inside the motion, pressing close where the creature had the least leverage. He delivered a short, sharp strike into a nerve cluster along its inner thigh. The Irkun grunted and stepped back. Again, Vale didn't chase. The chamber returned to another tense standoff. Hours later, the first undeniable change appeared. The Varchesh approached the nutrient port and began feeding. Normally, the Drail would challenge immediately for dominance. This time, it waited. It watched Vale instead. Vale stayed seated, conserving what strength he had left. When the Varchesh finished, the Drail moved to the port without conflict. Tarex leaned closer to the observation glass. "They are deferring," he said quietly. "Yes, Warden." The lattice entity descended partway from the wall, its limbs coiling near the floor as it approached Vale. Its skeletal structure shifted subtly beneath its skin, constantly realigning. Vale didn't attack. He simply held eye contact. The lattice entity extended a narrow limb toward him, stopping only inches from his face. Slowly, Vale raised his hand and pushed the limb aside, not violently, just enough to establish personal space. The lattice entity withdrew. The next incident happened during what was supposed to be a routine environmental fluctuation. A small power irregularity rippled through Sector 9, making the overhead lights flicker wildly for about 3 seconds. Normally, even a minor disruption like that would set apex violent entities off immediately. In past cycles, they would attack anything, barriers, each other, or whatever happened to be closest. This time was different. When the light strobed, the Drail tensed up. The Irkun lowered its stance as if preparing for impact. The Varchesh turned its attention toward Vale. He didn't move at all. The lights steadied again. Nobody attacked. Inside the observation hub, silence settled over the room. Tarex felt something unfamiliar creeping through his thoughts. Uncertainty. Vale wasn't asserting dominance through brute force. Instead, he was creating a pattern. Engage only when necessary. Strike with intention, conserve energy, hold your ground. And the creatures were beginning to adapt to that rhythm. By the third cycle, the chamber had grown noticeably calmer. The Varkesh no longer paced restlessly. It now sat with its back near one wall, its injured arm slowly healing. The Drail reduced its probing lunges. The Urkin stayed alert, but stopped charging altogether. For the first time, the lattice entity descended fully to the floor, folding its limbs neatly beneath its body. Vale slept in short bursts, never longer than a few minutes at a time. Every time he woke up, the creatures remained exactly where they had been. He never tried to physically dominate them. Instead, he controlled space. When the Drail drifted too close to where he rested, Vale stood immediately and stepped into its path, forcing it to give ground. When the Varkesh shifted aggressively toward the Urkin, Vale intercepted and delivered a single strike to the already damaged joint, a reminder rather than an attack. He refused to let chaos return. Recordings from the surveillance system soon began circulating among upper administration. Containment Sector 9, once the most unstable section of the prison, now showed a measurable drop in violent activity. Guard exposure time increased safely by 12%. Injury reports declined. Tarex soon received a message from Central Oversight. "Explain anomaly," the directive demanded. He replied carefully. "Behavioral shift under observation." By the fifth cycle, the change had become obvious even to untrained observers. When the nutrient ports activated simultaneously for all four entities, everyone expected violence. Before Vale arrived, that moment would have triggered immediate conflict. Instead, the creatures waited. They looked at Vale. He rose slowly to his feet and made a single gesture toward the Varkesh. The creature moved first and fed without interference. Then the Drail approached. After that, the Urkin. The lattice entity went last. Vale ate separately from a ration port near the entrance, never fully turning his back on the others. Tarex's crest tightened. "He is establishing order," one technician said. "Through threat?" another asked. "No," came the reply. "Through consistency." And that distinction mattered. The creatures no longer attacked randomly. They had learned that uncontrolled aggression brought pain inside a confined space, while discipline created stability. Vale hadn't explained this in words. He had demonstrated it. The event that finally forced Tarex to make a decision came without warning. A coolant line ruptured in a neighboring sector, triggering emergency containment protocols across multiple prison blocks. Automated systems initiated lockdown procedures. Energy fields surged. Inside Sector 9, the surge overloaded two internal partitions. For the first time since Vale's arrival, an unintended gap opened between the merged chamber and a nearby isolation cell. Inside that adjacent cell was another apex violent entity, a creature designated Thorn Maw, covered in jagged spikes and capable of spraying corrosive fluid. The breach alarm blared. Technicians scrambled inside the observation hub. "Seal it," Tarex ordered. "System lag. 30 seconds." Inside the chamber, the Thorn Maw forced its way through the damaged barrier. It was larger than the others and completely unfamiliar. It entered aggressively, spraying corrosive fluid across the floor. The Varkesh recoiled. The Drail backed away. The Urkin shifted uncertainly. Vale moved first. He didn't attack the Thorn Maw directly. Instead, he stepped between it and the other four creatures. He slammed his heel sharply against the floor, drawing its attention. The Thorn Maw turned toward him. It advanced. Vale slowly retreated, guiding the creature away from the others. Corrosive fluid splashed near his boots as he adjusted his angle and kept moving. The Thorn Maw lunged. Vale dove sideways and grabbed a broken piece of internal partition that had fallen during the surge. He raised it like a shield, angling it to deflect another spray. Behind him, something changed. The Drail moved, not toward Vale, but toward the Thorn Maw's exposed flank. It leaped, claws sinking into softer tissue between the spikes. The Varkesh followed immediately, driving its serrated hooks into the intruder's upper body. The Urkin charged from the side, slamming its massive weight into the thorn maw and pinning it against the reinforced wall. The lattice entity wrapped its limbs around the creature's lower extremities, locking it in place. Vale stepped back. He didn't join the attack. He let them finish it. Within seconds, the thorn maw lay subdued, restrained by 4 beings that had once been rivals. Inside the observation hub, no one spoke. The emergency systems sealed the breach, and the energy barriers reformed. Inside the chamber, the 4 apex violent entities didn't turn on each other after the fight. They released the thorn maw and returned to their previous positions, breathing heavily while watching Vale. He gave a small nod. "Good," he said quietly. Later, in that same cycle, during an automated diagnostic sweep, something else happened. One of the monitoring microphones picked up a series of vocalizations from the drail near the main barrier. The translation system struggled, but eventually identified repeated signals linked to distress and request. "Separation," the system translated. It also flagged another repeated meaning: remove. The Irkun struck the barrier once with its fist, not in rage, but for emphasis. Separate. Inside the observation hub, one of the technicians slowly lifted his head from the console. "They're requesting relocation," he said quietly. Tarex felt a tightening ripple along the plates of his exoskeleton. "They are specifically requesting removal from the human," the technician clarified. The recording replayed on the display. The creatures were not pleading for mercy. They were demanding distance, not from each other, but from Vale. Because when he was present, chaos no longer controlled the space. They couldn't fall back into their old instincts. Without technology, without enhancements, and without weapons, he had changed the environment simply through presence and discipline. Tarex stared into the chamber. Vale stood near the center, shoulders squared despite injuries that would have broken weaker beings long ago. The 4 most violent entities in the prison kept careful distance from him, not driven only by fear, but by recognition. In that moment, the warden understood something. Sector 9 had changed permanently. He had placed a human among monsters expecting terror. Instead, he had introduced a stabilizing force the monsters themselves could not endure. "Prepare transfer protocols," Tarex said at last. "For the human?" a guard asked. Tarex kept his eyes fixed on Vale. "No, for the monsters." Hours later, containment drones entered the chamber cautiously. The Varkesh accepted restraints without resistance. The Drail complied just as calmly. The Urkin lowered its arms willingly. The lattice entity folded inward, offering no struggle. One by one, they were moved back into separate cells, alone again. Vale remained standing in the now empty combined chamber. The barrier rose between them. Tarex entered alongside 2 guards, this time without shock armor. They stopped several meters away, maintaining a respectful distance. "You altered them," Tarex said. Vale wiped dried blood from his knuckles before answering. "I didn't change them," he said calmly. "I just showed them rules." Tarex studied him in silence for a long moment. "You were placed here as punishment." Vale gave a small shrug. "I don't break easy." Tarex inclined his head slightly. "No, you do not." He gestured to the guards. "Return him to standard confinement." As Vale was escorted out of Sector 9, the corridors seemed quieter than before. Behind reinforced barriers, the apex violent entities remained isolated once more, but their behavioral logs showed something new. Aggression spikes no longer reached former levels. Responses to stimuli had become measured instead of explosive. Prison staff expanded monitoring across other sectors. Whispers began spreading through administration. Humans were officially classified as physically average compared to most galactic species. Limited stamina, minimal natural armor, no built-in weapons. And yet, one unarmed human had entered the most dangerous containment block in the facility and imposed structure without authority, not through domination, through control. Tarex stood alone in the observation hub long after Vale had been removed. The recordings would be archived, analyzed, maybe even used for future experiments. But he already understood the truth. The monsters had not begged for mercy. They had asked to leave because the human forced them into a pattern they could not escape. Discipline had proven more suffocating than violence ever was. Out in the darkness between star systems, the forgotten prison continued drifting in silence, and within its official records a single notation remained. Human exposure in Sector 9 resulted in containment stabilization. Recommend caution. Some beings break under pressure, others become the pressure.